In the autumn of 1885, in a stone monastery hidden in the foothills of the Carpathian Range, an old woman named Sister Aneska was led down a corridor she had never been permitted to enter. She had served the order for 41 years. She had washed the dead. She had buried plague victims with her own hands. And yet the Mother Superior gripped her wrist like a child afraid of the dark and said only 7 words: "He has asked for you by name." Sister Aneska had never met the man waiting in that chamber. She had never spoken his name aloud. But when the heavy oak door opened, she saw a bed that was nearly 12 feet long, and lying upon it was a figure so vast that his hand alone covered the entire pillow beneath his head. His skin was the colour of old parchment. His beard reached past his ribs, and his eyes, when they opened, were the deep grey of a winter sea that had seen things no living person should remember. He spoke to her for 9 days. He told her things that did not appear in any book in any library in Europe. He told her about cities buried beneath cities. He told her about a war that no one was allowed to remember. He told her the real reason the world map had been redrawn 3 times in a single century. And on the 9th night, just before his final breath, he made her swear an oath. He told her that what he had said could not be written down for 100 years. And then he said one final sentence. A sentence so strange that Sister Aneska wrote it on the inside of her own forearm in ink that she made from crushed iron and walnut shells, so she would never forget. So her body would carry it into the grave with her if she had to. The journal she eventually left behind, sealed in a wooden box, was opened in 1986 by her great-great-niece. It was donated to a small archive in Krakow, and it sat there, untouched, for almost another 40 years, until last year, when a researcher cataloguing unprocessed religious documents from the late 19th century pulled a thin black volume from a shelf, opened it, and went silent for almost an hour. This is what was inside it. This is what the giant said. And this is why, even now, certain pages of that journal have been quietly removed from public access. If anything in this story matters to you, even a little, hit the subscribe button before you go any further. We are pulling threads here that other channels will not touch, and the only way to make sure you see the next one is to be on the list. Now, let us walk back into that chamber. Sister Aneska was born in 1814 inches, a village whose name no longer exists on any modern map. The village was burned in a fire that the official records attribute to a lightning strike, but the survivors who spoke of it in their old age always lowered their voices and said it was not lightning. It was something that fell, something that was thrown. The girl who would become Sister Aneska was 4 years old when she was pulled from the rubble of her family's home by a man she did not recognize, a man who, according to her own later account, was nearly 9 feet tall and wore a cloak that seemed to drink the light around it. He carried her, on foot, for 2 days. He did not speak. He left her on the steps of the monastery at dawn, knocked once on the door, and walked back into the trees. The sisters took her in. They never learned who the tall man was. But the Mother Superior of that era, a woman named Mother Hedvika, wrote in her own private correspondence that the child had arrived with a small wooden token tied around her neck. A token carved with a symbol that did not match any heraldry, any cross, any seal known to the church. The token was kept locked away. It would later be returned to Sister Aneska on the morning she was led to the giant's bedside. She did not know, until that moment, that the man on the bed was the same man who had carried her out of the fire 71 years earlier. He had been waiting that long to speak to her. He had been waiting that long to die. To understand what he told her in that chamber, you have to understand what was happening in the world in 1885. The official history will tell you that it was a quiet year. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty's pedestal, the Berlin Conference, where European powers calmly carved up the African continent like a Sunday roast. But beneath that surface, something else was occurring. Cathedrals across Europe were being mysteriously emptied of certain artifacts. Train manifests from that year, recently digitized, show enormous unmarked crates being moved across borders without inspection, paid for in gold, by accounts that no longer exist. Photographs from world expositions show buildings that, by the official narrative, should not have been possible to construct in the time given. And across rural Russia, rural Romania, rural Hungary, peasants began reporting that the old ones were dying. They did not say who the old ones were, they simply said, the old ones, and they said it in a tone of voice that suggested the world was about to become a smaller, lonelier place. The giant on that bed in the Carpathian monastery told Sister Aneska that he was one of the last. He did not say the last of what. Not at first. He told her that his people had once lived in cities that stretched across what is now Central Asia, across what is now the great empty plains of the American West, across what is now ocean. He told her that the maps she had been taught from were not just inaccurate, they were deliberately designed to make her forget. He told her that a continent she had never heard the name of had been removed from the historical record within the lifetime of her own grandmother, and that the war that erased it was not fought with cannons and rifles. It was fought with paper, with ink, with the slow, patient work of teachers who taught children a version of the past that did not include the things their grandparents had seen with their own eyes. Sister Anezka listened to this with her hands folded in her lap. She was 71 years old. She had buried more bodies than she could count. She was not a woman who frightened easily. But on the second day, when the giant told her about the cities under the cities, she had to leave the room, walk into the garden, and press her forehead against the cold stone of the chapel wall until her teeth stopped chattering. He told her that beneath the great cathedrals of Europe there were older structures, not crypts, not catacombs, whole buildings, whole streets, whole levels of civilization that had been buried, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by what he called the resetting. He used that word over and over. The resetting. He said it had happened more than once. He said it would happen again. He said the people who orchestrated it were not evil in the way she understood evil. They simply believed that humanity could not survive its own memory. That if the species was to continue, certain things had to be forgotten, certain achievements had to be unbuilt, certain names had to be erased from the tongues of the living. He told her about a city called Aratha. He said it had stood for 9,000 years on a peninsula that no longer existed because the peninsula itself had been deliberately submerged. He told her that the spires of Aratha had been visible from 100 miles out at sea, and that ships from a dozen nations had once docked there to trade in things she would not have words for. Light that could be poured into a vessel, sound that could be folded into a cloth, time that could be measured in the breath of a stone. He said his own great-grandmother had walked the avenues of Aratha as a girl. He said that when the resetting came, the priests of the city had been given 6 days to choose what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. They chose to be forgotten. They chose silence. They chose the long sleep. Sister Anezka asked him, on the third day, why he was telling her any of this, why her, why a country nun in a country monastery in a country that, by his own account, had been invented less than a century before. He looked at her for a long time, and then he told her that the symbol on the wooden token she had worn around her neck as a child was the seal of the priestesses of Aratha. He told her that her bloodline, however thinned, however scattered across the centuries, was the reason he had carried her out of the fire when she was 4 years old. He had been searching for someone like her for 90 years. She was, he said, the last living person on the European continent who carried even a drop of that lineage. She did not believe him, not at first, but on the 4th day he asked her to bring him a basin of water and a single white feather from the chapel altar. She did. He laid the feather on the surface of the water. He spoke a word she did not understand, and the feather rose, slowly, until it hung in the air a full hand's width above the basin, where it remained, motionless, for the entire afternoon. She did not leave the room again after that. The giant told her about the war. He called it the Long Quieting. He said it had begun in the 14th century, though some of his kin would argue it began earlier. He said it was not a war fought between armies. It was a war fought between two ideas about what the human animal was permitted to know. On one side were what he called the keepers, who believed that knowledge, all knowledge, every scrap of it, belonged to those who had earned it through study and suffering and the long years of apprenticeship. On the other side were what he called the gardeners, who believed that humanity was a crop, and that a crop must be pruned, and that every few centuries the field had to be burned to the roots so that something new could grow. He said the gardeners had been winning for a long time. He said the Great Library at Alexandria was not destroyed by accident. He said it had been one of 17 libraries destroyed in a coordinated effort that spanned 300 years. He said that the burning of books in Spain in the 16th century, and the burning of books in Mexico in the same century, and the systematic destruction of indigenous records across the Americas in the centuries that followed, were not separate events. They were a single campaign. He said the same campaign continued, in his own time, in different forms, the redrawing of maps, the standardization of languages, the invention of new histories to fill the spaces where old histories had been carved out. He told her that in 1812, when Napoleon's army had retreated from Moscow, they had not been retreating from the cold, they had been retreating from something else. Something the Russian generals had unburied beneath the city, something they had been instructed by a small council of priests to unbury at the moment of greatest danger. He did not say what it was. He only said that Napoleon had seen it, and that Napoleon had never spoken of it for the rest of his life, and that the men who had been with him that night had all died within 5 years, of causes their physicians could not explain. He told her that the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871 was not caused by a cow. He told her that the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which had occurred just 2 years before their conversation, had been what he called a finishing stroke. He said that the sound of that eruption, which had circled the globe 7 times, had been heard not just by living ears, but by something else. He said that something else had now woken up. He said that the resetting was beginning again, and that this time it would not look like fire and flood, it would look like progress, it would look like invention. It would look like a great forward march of the human species, and the people swept up in that march would never know that they were being herded toward a cliff. He told her about the maps. He told her that the maps her teachers had used to instruct her in geography were the 3rd generation of a forgery that had begun in the late 17th century. He said that the original maps, the ones drawn by sailors who had actually crossed the oceans, had shown a world she would not recognize. He said there had been an inland sea in the middle of what is now the Sahara, drained, he said, within the lifetime of her own great-grandfather. He said there had been a chain of islands across the North Atlantic, every single one of them inhabited, every single one of them now beneath the waves. He told her about the ages. He said that what the historians of her time called the Dark Ages had not been dark. He said the buildings put up during those centuries, the cathedrals, the abbeys, the great stone halls, had not been built by the men who lived in those centuries. He said those men had simply moved into them. He said they had found them already standing, in the forests, on the hilltops, at the bends of rivers, abandoned by an earlier civilization whose tools and techniques were beyond anything the medieval mind could replicate. He said the medieval people had lit fires in those buildings, and slept in them, and worshipped in them, and slowly, over generations, convinced themselves that their own grandfathers had built them. He told her that the railways being built across her continent in the year of their conversation were not, in fact, being built. They were being uncovered. He said that beneath the soil lay the iron tracks of a system that had once carried goods and passengers across distances she could not imagine, in vehicles that had not required coal or wood or any visible source of fuel at all. He said the modern engineers were simply scraping away the dirt, polishing the rails, and replacing the missing sections with their own crude approximations. He said the great train stations of Europe, the ones being celebrated as marvels of 19th century achievement, were in many cases the upper floors of structures that descended 4 or 5 stories below ground level, into halls and chambers that had been bricked over and forgotten, and were now, in his time, beginning to be quietly rediscovered by men who did not, under any circumstances, mention it in their official reports. On the 7th day, Sister Aneska asked him if there was anything that could be done. He smiled for the first time. His teeth were unnaturally even, and unnaturally white, and there were too many of them. He said that the only thing that could be done was the only thing that had ever been done, to remember, to write down, to bury the truth in places where it could be found later, by people who had not yet been born, who would dig it up not because they had been told to, but because some part of them already knew that something was missing. He said that she would be one of those buriers. He said that she would write down what he had told her, and that she would seal it, and that she would not allow it to be opened in her lifetime, or in the lifetime of her nieces, or in the lifetime of her nieces' children. He said that the right hands would find it when the right hands were ready. He said that this was how it had always been done, that every generation contained a few people whose only purpose was to carry a sealed message forward through time. They did not have to understand the message. They did not have to believe it. They simply had to keep it and pass it on and trust that one day someone would open it and weep. On the 8th day, he gave her a list of names, the names of cities that had been removed from history, the names of people who had been removed from history, the names of inventions that had been made and unmade and would have to be made again. He gave her the location of 3 sites in Eastern Europe where, he said, the older buildings still stood, buried under the more recent buildings, and where, he said, the right tools would one day reveal them. He told her that one of these sites had now been excavated by a man whose name has not yet been made public, but who, in 1923, took a series of photographs that he was forced to surrender to authorities, and which have not been seen since. On the 9th day, the giant grew quiet. He had not eaten in 5 days. He had drunk only water. His skin had gone from parchment to something thinner, something almost translucent, and Sister Aneska could see the slow movement of dark shapes beneath it, shapes that did not seem to belong to any anatomy she had ever studied. He asked her to come closer. She did. He took her hand in his, and his hand was so large that her own hand disappeared into it as if she had reached into a sleeve. He said her name. He used a name she had never been called by anyone living, a name she did not recognize, but which she somehow knew, in the deepest part of herself, was the name she had been born with, before the fire, before the village, before the man in the cloak had carried her to the steps of the monastery. And then he said the final sentence, the one she would later write on her own forearm in ink made from crushed iron and walnut shells. The sentence that the researcher in Krakow, last year, opened the journal to find written across an entire page, in the trembling hand of a 71-year-old woman who had clearly written it in the hours immediately following his death. The sentence read, "The ones who buried us are still here. They wear our faces. They speak with our tongues. And when the bell rings at the end of the next century, they will count us, and they will take from us what they took from him." Sister Aneska closed the giant's eyes. She washed his body, alone, with a cloth she had brought from the laundry. She found, when she did so, that his bones were not the bones of any creature she had ever prepared for burial. His sternum was a single curved plate, like the breastbone of a bird, but vast. His ribs interlocked at the front, in a pattern that resembled a woven basket. His skull, when she finally lifted his head to wash beneath it, had a second small chamber at the base, a hollow that no human skull contains, and which, she wrote, seemed to hum very faintly when she pressed her ear to it. She did not tell the Mother Superior any of this. She buried him, with the help of 2 other sisters who had been sworn to silence, in a chamber beneath the chapel that she would later seal with her own hands, mortar and stone, working through the night until her fingers bled. The official records of the monastery list him as a benefactor who had endowed the order with a substantial bequest and who had been laid to rest in the crypt as per his own request. His name, in those records, is given as Brother Tomas. There is no Brother Tomas anywhere else in the order's history. There is no record of his birth, his ordination, or his arrival at the monastery. He simply appears in the ledger of 1,885 dies and is buried. Sister Aneska lived for another 23 years. She wrote in her journal almost every night. The journal was found, as I told you at the beginning, in 1986 by her great-great-niece. It was donated to a small religious archive in Krakow, where it sat largely unread, until a researcher pulled it from a shelf last year and recognized, by the symbol drawn on the inside of the front cover, that the document she was holding was something the official histories had been waiting 100 years to forget. The journal is now, according to the most recent statement from the archive, undergoing a period of restricted access while it is being prepared for scholarly publication. The pages describing the location of the 3 excavation sites have been temporarily withdrawn, pending consultation with the relevant authorities. The page containing the giant's final sentence has been photographed, and the photograph circulates among a small number of researchers, but the original page, according to one of them, is no longer in the volume. It has been removed. It has been, as the gardeners would say, pruned. But Sister Aneska was thorough. She had carried the sentence on her own forearm, in ink made from crushed iron and walnut shells, until the day she died. And when her body was prepared for burial in the autumn of 1908, the sister who washed her noticed the marking and copied it, by candlelight, onto the back of a holy card that she kept tucked inside her psalter for the next 40 years. That holy card has now surfaced. It is, at the time of this recording, in the possession of a private collector in Vienna, who has agreed to allow a small number of independent researchers to examine it. The sentence on the card matches the sentence in the photograph from the journal, word for word, mark for mark. The ones who buried us are still here. They wear our faces. They speak with our tongues. And when the bell rings at the end of the next century, they will count us, and they will take from us what they took from him. The bell at the end of the next century after 1885, that places us, by the giant's own calendar, somewhere in the present decade, somewhere in the years we are now living through. Some of the researchers who have read the full journal believe the giant was speaking metaphorically, that the bell is a symbol, that the counting is a symbol, that nothing literal will occur. Others are not so sure. Others have begun to notice, in the news of the past several years, certain patterns that they say resemble the patterns the giant described, the redrawing of maps, the standardization of languages, this time through algorithms rather than school teachers, the quiet disappearance of certain inventions, the quiet appearance of certain others, presented as new, that older texts seem to indicate were known long before, the slow, patient gardening of the human field. Sister Aneska, in her final entry, written 6 days before her death, returned one last time to the question of why he had told her. Why a country nun? Why the descendant of a city no one remembered? She answered her own question, in the simple, unadorned language she had used throughout her life. She wrote that he had told her because someone had to be told, that every story needs a witness, even a story no one will be allowed to read for 100 years. That the act of speaking the truth out loud, even into the ear of a single old woman in a cold stone chamber in the Carpathian foothills, was itself a kind of resistance, a kind of seed, a kind of buried thing waiting for the right hands. Her final sentence in the journal, written in a hand so weak the ink barely registers on the page, reads as follows: "I have done what he asked. I have written it down. I have hidden it well. And when you read this, whoever you are, in whatever year you are reading it, know that I saw him with my own eyes, and that the world is older and stranger and more full of buried voices than your teachers have allowed you to imagine. Remember him. Remember Aratha. Remember that the field has been burned before and will be burned again, and that the only thing that survives the burning is what is buried deep." She signed her name, Anezka, and the date, the 3rd of October, 1908. She died 6 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, in the same chamber where the giant had died 23 years before. The sister who was with her at the end reported that her last words were not in any language anyone in the monastery recognized. They were spoken slowly, with great difficulty, and they ended, according to the witness, with a single phrase that sounded almost like a question. The witness wrote it down phonetically. It has since been examined by a linguist who specializes in extinct Indo-European tongues. He has tentatively identified it as a variant of a language that has not been spoken aloud in approximately 3,000 years. The phrase, translated as "best as anyone can manage," means, "Are you there yet? Have you found it? Is it time?" The journal sits in the archive in Krakow. The holy card sits in a private collection in Vienna. The chamber beneath the chapel, where the giant was buried, has not been opened in 140 years. The monastery itself was closed in 1962, and the building now serves as a small regional museum, where tourists pay a modest fee to walk through corridors that, according to the official literature, have no particular historical significance. But somewhere beneath those tourists' feet, in a chamber sealed by an old woman with bleeding fingers in the autumn of 1885, a body lies that is not quite human. A body whose ribs interlock like a woven basket. A body whose skull contains a chamber that hums faintly when pressed. A body that once carried a 4-year-old girl out of a burning village and waited 71 years to tell her what he had been carrying for far longer. A body that, if the giant himself was telling the truth, is not the only such body buried beneath the floors of the old places of Europe. A body that is, perhaps, still waiting, still listening, still hoping that the right hands, in the right year, will come and unseal the chamber and finish the work that an old nun in a cold stone monastery began, with crushed iron and walnut shells, on the inside of her own forearm, on the 9th night of a conversation she was never supposed to have. That is the story. That is what was in the journal. That is what the giant said before the final breath. Whether you believe it or not is, in the end, a question only you can answer. But the next time you walk past an old building, an old church, an old monastery, an old foundation that seems somehow heavier than its stones should account for, remember Sister Aneska. Remember the resetting. Remember the long quieting. Remember that the field has been burned before. And remember, above all, that the only thing that survives the burning is what is buried deep. If this story stayed with you, the way it has stayed with me since I first read the translated pages of that journal, then there is something you can do. You can share it. You can speak it out loud to someone you trust, the way Sister Aneska spoke it into her own pages on a cold autumn night in 1908. You can be a witness, because every story needs one, and the ones we do not pass on are the ones that get buried and forgotten and lost. The next video on this channel goes deeper into one of the 3 excavation sites the giant named in the journal. The site that, according to several independent researchers, has already been quietly cleared of its original contents, and whose original photographs, taken in 1923, have not been seen in public since. That video is on screen now. Click it, and keep watching, because the bell, by the giant's own calendar, has already begun to ring.